United States today, there are over 21 million veterans who have served in one of the 5 U.S. military branches. These 21 million people make up a unique group of individuals who have traveled to different places, worked different jobs, and even fought on the front lines of battle to bravely serve and protect our country. Today we have the honor of speaking with John O'Donnell, a veteran of the Vietnam War who is currently a professor at the Pennsylvania State University in State College, Pennsylvania. Thank you for being with us today, Mr. O'Donnell.
You're welcome. Thanks, Travis.
Let's first start in, what was the branch of the military you served in?
I was in the Army.
And what rank?
Well, I was what's called a Specialist 5 when I actually finished my service. So I started out as a draftee, went through enlisted ranks and graduated. Spec 5 would be comparable to a sergeant, basically, same rank.
And where did you serve?
Well, I went through basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana, went to helicopter school at Fort Rucker, Alabama, and then went to Vietnam for 11 months.
Wow, and you were drafted, correct?
I was drafted.
You were drafted. How did that make you feel?
Well, I was never happy about being drafted, and like many people, I was pretty much anti-Vietnam War prior to being drafted. But I had kind of made a commitment to myself to serve if I was drafted.
So you were mentally prepared for if you were?
I'm not sure if anybody's ever mentally prepared to get drafted and then end up having to go to war.
So describe to us the first day of your service, not in Vietnam, but the first day when you arrived to basic training.
Geez, if I can recall correctly, my recollection is you reported to a draft office. In my case, I was in Pittsburgh. I lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and took a plane to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Went through some testing, and that first day is kind of like you'd see in the movies, I guess, where you meet some drill sergeant who yells at you when you get off the bus at the base. But then you go through a lot of physical testing and kind of academic testing to determine where the Army wants to place you. And that was probably the first day kind of thing, or first few days at least.
Can you expand on both the physical and academic testing that they would put you through?
Well, there was a lot of, the academic testing was the kind of thing where they tested whether you could read or write, whether you could do basic math problems, what you knew about history and that sort of thing. I was a college graduate and had completed a year of law school before I got drafted, so I was really considerably older than the typical draftee. I was 24 years old when I got drafted, and the typical draftee was 18, 19 years old. And had just gotten out of high school. So I was older and much better educated than the typical draftee. So the academic screening process was pretty easy to get through. I had also been a runner in college and a basketball player, and I was in pretty good shape for being 24 years old. So the physical testing, which generally consisted of running and push-ups and kind of typical kind of physical testing, was pretty easy for me too. I was probably in a lot better shape than a lot of the 18 and 19-year-olds that I was also competing with at the time.
And you had spoken about being yelled at, or not yelled at, but confronted by your instructors or your higher officers. Was there one in particular that stays with you?
No individual, no. The Army from day one wants to instill discipline. They want people obeying orders and kind of conforming to discipline. So I think that was probably why they start doing that right away. Mm-hmm. And certainly through basic training, and less so as you go through various stages, and in my case, going to helicopter school at Fort Rucker. it was much less kind of a harassment kind of an environment than basic training would be.
How was helicopter training? Vietnam is maybe towards the tail end of World War II. We started seeing the incorporation of helicopters in the military, but Vietnam was the first war that they were used very whole-handedly. What was it like learning this new type of?
Well,
aviation?
initially I signed up for pilot training, and started into pilot training, but then I failed a physical based on my eyesight. They said I had no depth perception. And so I immediately switched from being in the pilot program, which would have required me to spend 2 more years in the service, by the way. But they moved me over into the crew chief program in Huey's. The UH-1 was, or Huey was the basic, most used helicopter back in Vietnam. And so I moved over into the crew chief program. The crew chief was really the flying mechanic. If something happened to the helicopter while you were flying, the crew chief was supposed to fix it and get it flying again. My wife used to always tell me, never fly in anything you fix, because she didn't have much faith in my mechanical abilities. But I was actually pretty good at it. And learned a lot about it. It was kind of interesting to me because I was never terribly mechanical. I learned a lot of new stuff. And I still couldn't find the dipstick on the car in our Mercury. But I explained to my wife, I said, if we were flying with a T-53 Lycoming turbojet engine, I could fix that. I might not be able to change the oil in the car, but I could fix that turbojet. So.
And being the crew chief, you obviously had a crew. And who was in your crew?
On a Huey, it was, there were 4 people on the crew. One was the pilot, one was the co-pilot, you had a door gunner, and you had the crew chief. Now, when you were flying the helicopter, the crew chief essentially was a door gunner. People used to say, what's the difference between the door gunner and the crew chief? And I used to say, well, I've got a toolbox under my seat, and he doesn't. So I can slow down the bullets coming from down below with my toolbox, and he can't because he doesn't have one.
Right. So let's go into life during Vietnam. What was going through your mind the day before you left?
I think the day before I left, my wife and I went whitewater rafting on the Yakagani River, which was really a good thing because it kept my mind off of anything else because we were pretty focused on whitewater. I remember the day I left, flying from Pittsburgh, I think first to Fort Dix, New Jersey. I think I was crying on the airplane, leaving my wife behind. And there was probably a lot of trepidation about what was going to happen in Vietnam.
What were your first impressions of Vietnam when you landed in the airport?
Well, Vietnam's a tropical country. It's a very hot, steamy, humid place to be. I think my first reaction probably was that the airport where we landed, Tan Son Nhut, near Saigon, was much more like a modern airport than it was. I probably expected something less developed. And I think that, and from there we went to the Long Bin Air Force Base for kind of orientation into the country. There was some training, I think, that went on, and then you got assigned out to your units from there. From there, initially I got sent to my battalion, which was the 229 Aviation Battalion, which was stationed up in Tay Ninh, up near the Cambodian border. And I was up there for about 3 months as a crew chief, and kind of flying around in and out of Cambodia and around that whole area up there. And we were at the bottom of this mountain if I recall correctly, it was Nui Bao Din, I think it was the name, Black Virgin Mountain. And I always wondered who it was that decided that we should put this base at the bottom of the mountain, and the bad guys had control of the top of the mountain with their artillery, and they used to shell our base sporadically, either at night or during the day, or almost any time, I guess. I remember the door being blown off my hooch one morning at about 7 o'clock in the morning. Boom. The door and the end of the hooch kind of blew away. I remember another time we got shelled in the middle of the day. I was somewhere inside the building, and suddenly everything started to blow up around the base. But so we did that, and I was flying missions and stuff out of Penn for about 3 months.
The French were there before us and had their campaign and ultimately called Vietnam a quagmire of a situation. Did you feel that you were setting foot into something uncontrollable, or to the fact that this was the first time that we're facing an enemy with no uniform and no guerrilla warfare and just a whole new aspect of combat?
Well, I knew that it was going to be hard, because guerrilla warfare is different than war was like in World War I or World War II or wars before that, where people clearly wore identifiable uniforms so you could tell who the enemy was. And now you've got this war which was very different, where the enemy is trying to blend into the population, and I think that made the war scarier for everybody, because when you saw, and of course there were all the atrocities that came out at various times during and after the war, and a lot of those occurred simply because you couldn't identify who the enemy was, and so soldiers would go into little villages and start shooting people on the assumption that they were the enemy. So I don't know if I thought we were in that same quagmire, but based on my own studies, I didn't have a lot of faith that we were going to change the mindset of the Vietnamese people, because their religious and cultural backgrounds probably were better suited to socialism or communism than they were to democracy anyway.
Let's broaden on that. What makes Vietnam unique is that it's in a pivotal point of cultural, the word for it, cultural misunderstanding, if you will. You got the nationalists, the Buddhists, then we install Christianity, even to the higher extents of their government. But not only that, on our side, you have the civil rights movement and both black and white soldiers on the same battlefield, when there's so much distress in our own country about civil rights. How did that all affect you and the people around you, and just the cultural aspect of Vietnam?
I don't know that it affected me so much. I think most of the American soldiers that were there had very little appreciation for the history, for the culture, for the religion. You know, I had studied it some, but I think that I was a little unusual in having done that. I ended up, before I left, I ended up being high enough rank that I was on promotion boards for at least the enlisted soldiers. And I used to always ask them one or two basic questions. Can you name the president of Vietnam? And virtually none of them could. And I'd ask them one or two other questions about the culture of Vietnam in the course of interviewing for promotions. And mostly I was doing my own kind of little survey to see, you know, what do people really know about this country? You spend a year here, shouldn't you learn something about the country? And our soldiers didn't really bother to do that so much, so it was different.
Do you believe ignorance played a vital part in how we went about the war, or how anything, aspects of the war?
there was a lot of ignorance about the war. I think, frankly, there were lots of things that drove that war. There were economic factors. You mentioned the French and colonialism, and in that whole part of the world, there was a lot of colonialism. There was a lot of influence from the French and the English and some others in different parts of that part of Asia. For the French, it was an economic factor for a long time. The Michelin rubber plantations generated a lot of raw material for the French rubber industry. But some of the other things that I believe drove the war, professional military people need a war in order to be promoted. That had something to do with continuing to drive the war. Other economic factors, people having self-interest, wanting to make money off of it. I mean, there's a lot of factors that drive the war. There's a lot of ignorance on the part of people back home that aren't close enough to understand why we do what we do when we're engaged in a military action. I'm sure that's still true.
We're going to touch on the reception going back to the United States in a bit, but could you explain how combat worked in Vietnam? And this was also, if we touch back to the civil rights and engaging with African Americans in combat, and even above that, South Vietnamese and their incorporation into the combat aspect.
How did combat work? That's a tough question. Again, it's guerrilla warfare, and I think what the basic premise was that if you could identify a group of enemy, the Viet Cong, people coming basically from North Vietnam down through these various trails and tunnels and paths and things into South Vietnam. Basically, anytime somebody thought they had identified a large group of Viet Cong movement, the way combat worked was we put a bunch of people on our helicopters, took them out to wherever we thought those people were, and tried to kill them. That was the premise. Now, and a lot of times it was a valid premise, and sometimes it wasn't a valid premise. But that's sort of the way the battle's organized. You looked for as large a group of the enemy as you could find, to the extent you could identify the enemy, and you went out to get them. The South Vietnamese participated, and we worked together with South Vietnamese. We had Thai soldiers actually along with us in addition to South Vietnamese. There were all different kinds of cultural clashes and that sort of thing that existed. The Thais, for example, had a daily ration of opium allotted to them. I mean, just given to them by their government. So they were, some of them were fairly happy a lot of the time. And of course, it was completely illegal for an American soldier to be using opium or marijuana or anything. But you got that culture clash going on. But then you'd come back in the evening and you'd be living with the South Vietnamese and the Thais, and everybody else would be together. And a lot of times, these guys who were out on the fire bases, out away from the main camps, were living with them 24 hours a day, and everybody kind of bought into whatever they liked about that culture. Oh, the opium sounds like a good deal, or the marijuana, whatever it happened to be. So there were a lot of clashes going on there, in addition to just combat. And it was an interesting place because of all that, I guess.
You flew in the 229th Aviation Battalion, which, is this the patch of said battalion?
This is the battalion patch up here. This is the 1st Cavalry Division patch over here. This is a rank. This is a Spec 5 rank, and then I've got my flight wings here and ribbons for each of the medals. These are Presidential Unit Citation badges over on that side.
Were you pinned by the president?
No. A Presidential Unit Citation basically is a citation for the unit based on achievements of the group. And in our case, we had 4 during the period of time that I was there.
Let's talk about the cavalry division and how this was the first time that we've seen large incorporations of helicopters, and you flew Hueys.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain to us a mission flying a Huey, the aspects of the helicopter? You said you'd pick up a squadron of men and then fly them to a particular location. So this must have took a lot of know-how to position your helicopter and fly it through a very densely populated country of jungle and foliage.
Well, basically the 1st Cavalry Division, I think goes back to the horse cavalry, of 150 years ago. Helicopters became kind of the technology for moving troops starting in the 60s and 70s. And basically we transported troops from base camp or from fire bases out to wherever those groups of enemy soldiers were. We used them for search and rescue. Sometimes the search and rescue was for other helicopters that might have gone down. I can remember one mission where a general and his staff had disappeared for a while, and we had to go out and just search and find them and bring them back, and we did that. But basically it was the transport, how you got people out and how you got people back. You kind of hoped that when you were landing that you weren't landing right on top of the enemy, because that's why lots of people got killed, because it was hard to figure out where they were exactly. And of course with a helicopter you've got to find enough space to drop it down and get out. You can't, and so you need a little bit of an open space. It doesn't need to be huge because you can go almost straight down and back up, but you'd like to have a little more space than that. And the smaller the space, the harder it is to see what is around you. We used to say every landing was a controlled crash. If you didn't do too much damage to the skids on the helicopter, we considered it a good landing, basically. And sometimes you didn't even get all the way onto the ground. Sometimes you would just drop troops when you were still a couple of feet off the ground and start loading troops back on and try not to land if you could avoid it, because sometimes you needed to either get in quick or get out quick. So logistically, you were dealing with whatever the circumstances were.
Mm-hmm. You then took up a desk job after your many days being in the helicopter.
Which was a wonderful thing, by the way.
Was there, besides the job itself, you were also a teacher for some of the younger enlisted men?
Yeah, I taught GED classes for soldiers who had not graduated from high school, and there were a lot of them. You know, the typical soldier. We had I grew up in a fairly middle-class environment where most kids went off to college when they graduated from high school, and almost everybody graduated from high school. But when I got drafted, and even in basic training, you start immediately meeting people from all over the country who maybe never went past the 7th or 8th or 9th grade, and when they turned 18, either enlisted or got drafted. And for a lot of them, it was the first time they'd ever had a full set of clothes or shoes, or ate 3 meals a day, whatever it happened to be. So there were a lot of soldiers that had not graduated from high school. So I started teaching the GED classes, and we actually built a school in Benoit with the help of the Seabees, who provided the materials and some of the labor support. But I organized a bunch of the folks from our battalion to help build that, and then we kept teaching the classes. And I brought in a Vietnamese teacher to try and teach us Vietnamese, and frankly that didn't go too far, but we tried it out.
Do you remain in contact with any of your students?
No. One of the problems with that was that in Vietnam, people didn't go over as a unit and come back as a unit. You went over individually, you replaced someone, and you spent a year doing a tour of duty, and you were not part of someone who came over as a group. And people rotated in and out, 1 and 2 and 3 at a time, basically, from each company. And so, like today, I think most of the people going to Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan typically go over as a unit, and the unit comes back together. That didn't happen in Vietnam. In Vietnam, people went over 1 at a time, 2 at a time, and came back that way. So contact was hard. And it wasn't people that you knew when you went over that you came back with. So I've had virtually no contact. I actually found one of my old commanding officers lives here in State College. And when I discovered that, we got together and played golf together and have had some dinners and lunches and stuff together. And it's been fun.
Went to the Rathskeller?
Well, we didn't make the Rathskeller, but we've played some golf together.
Well, I think that one medal that is missing, and might be, in my opinion, the most important one, is if you had been rewarded one for a teacher, being a teacher. But if you could explain to us some of the medals that we're looking at.
Well, we've got a Bronze Star, the Air Medal. The Air Medal was generally granted for about every 35 combat missions, and I was right around the 2nd Air Medal when I quit flying. This is an Army Commendation Medal. The Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry is issued by the Republic of Vietnam. This is Vietnam Service Medal, the Good Conduct Medal, and the National Defense Medal. Most of these, if you pay attention and don't screw up, you get one of those. The Bronze Star and the Air Medal and the Army Commendation Medal are the special ones, actually.
And did you receive these once you finished your tour?
Actually, I got the Bronze Star shortly after finishing my tour as a crew chief, and the Air Medal shortly after that. The Army Commendation Medal, I think, was later, as I was close to the end of the tour.
Did you feel a sense of pride when you were receiving these medals, or what was going through your head?
I'm sure I was proud to have done the job. I think whatever job I did, and maybe the reason I survived was simply a matter of trying to focus on doing the best you could, every single day when you went out. Whether you were door gunner or crew chief, whatever it happened to be. If you didn't do the job well, you were going to get killed, so you might as well do it well.
Do it right the first time.
So,
and here we have...
You only get one time.
This is also very true. Here we have you back in the heyday.
This is my John Wayne picture. Looks like that guy out of Jurassic Park that chased the raptors. But I think in the evenings, a lot of times there was time that people would sit around taking pictures to send home to whoever you were sending your pictures home to. In my case, it was my wife. And I wrote letters either every day or every other day, probably, back home. So,
was that one of the hardest parts about being away from home?
It was. It was a very hard thing to be separated. I got married on Christmas leave right after I finished basic training, actually. So I was married for about 6 months when I got shipped off to Vietnam.
How were the holidays when you were over in Vietnam?
One of the most memorable Christmases, every Christmas I still think of this, but Christmas of 1970, I had my office job by then, and I'd been working in the office, and one of my best friends was the chaplain. The chaplain was a guy named John Chortos, and he was a Catholic priest from Clerton, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And he and I got to be very close friends. We were both Pittsburghers. And we decided that for Christmas Day, we were going to go out to all the fire bases and celebrate Christmas with the platoons that were out on the fire bases. So we got a group of 3 or 4 guys together and started practicing Christmas carols the week before Christmas. And we went to the PX and bought up everything we could in terms of the big disposable razors, cases of beer, any other things that we could find that we thought that the guys out on the fire bases could use. And on Christmas Day, we loaded all this stuff on a helicopter and we flew out and we went around to all these different little spots out in the boonies and distributed, just gave away all this stuff that we'd bought up at the PX. And we sang Christmas carols. And it was kind of a bizarre sight to be out on a fire base in Vietnam. It's 110 degrees or something. You've got kind of a defoliated area around most of these areas. It's kind of looks like the red clay of Alabama almost in a lot of the areas. We're out there singing Christmas carols and celebrating Christmas with these guys, and most of the times that we stopped, the guys were just crying and weeping by the time we left because we had remembered Christmas. And every Christmas, I can tell you, I still think about that. There's not a Christmas, I don't think, that's gone by that I don't remember that day. And it was kind of fun.
Santa flew a Huey on that night.
We actually took masking tape and put Merry Christmas on the tail of the Huey.
The little touches.
Yeah.
It's the little things that count. Let's talk about when you arrived home. Mm-hmm. It's known about some of the disrespect that soldiers received, particularly in this war. Baby killer was a popular term. Did you receive the same type of welcome, if you will, when you arrived back home, or what was your experience when you stepped off the plane?
I did not experience much of that or any of that I can remember. At the same time, I don't think that I talked much with people about the war. When I came back, I went back to law school and finished law school after I came back from Vietnam. I had 2 years left of law school to finish. And I went back to law school, and there were a lot of us, frankly, that were coming back from Vietnam. There were quite a few people actually in my law school class who had been gone for the same period of time from the end of our first year until the time we came back 3 years later. And I think for the most part, people just didn't talk about it for a long time. And by not talking about it, people just didn't know that you'd served, and so you didn't get much reaction.
How do you pick up life after war?
I tried to move on, I guess, as if nothing had happened, although I think you are clearly changed by the experience. I can remember jumping out of bed one time as a car backfired going down the street in the middle of the night. I was ready to roll under the bed. But after a while, that went away. I managed pretty well, but again, I was a lot older when I went over. And I think that my sense was that by the time you get to be 24, 25, which is what I was when I was in Vietnam, you've pretty much formed your personality and your beliefs and all that sort of thing. I think these kids that went over at 18 and 19 years old, and that may not sound like a lot of years difference, but when you're 18 and 19, somebody who's 25 is a lot older than you are. When I was going through basic training, I had these kids calling me Mr. O'Donnell because they thought I was such an old wrinkle. I think it was a lot harder for the younger kids to come back because I think they were probably impacted a lot more than I was by it even.
Do you still openly participate in any ceremonies or
I don't do too much, don't do anything really, if I can help it. Back in the late 80s, a friend of mine, I was living outside of Chicago, and a friend of mine who was also a veteran came to me, and he knew that I had served in Vietnam, and he said, we're trying to get a group of Vietnam vets together to march in, I think it was a 4th of July parade in our local town. And he asked me if I would do it. And I thought long and hard, and I didn't really like the idea of marching in parades, but we finally got, there must have been 8 or 10 of us together. And I agreed to march with him, and I think his wife or kids or somebody made up a banner for the group of Vietnam vets. And we marched in the parade, and it was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. And the people along the parade route just stood up as we went by and applauded, and there were people crying, and it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that. We did that for 2 or 3 years, and then that group kind of broke up, I think. And I'm not sure that I've been in a parade like that since. So that was probably late 80s, early 90s.
And since then, what have you been doing?
Well, for the past 40 years, I've been living a 10-year plan, basically. I've done a lot of different things. As I said, I finished law school, practiced law, worked for corporations in legal and management jobs, and I've been teaching at Penn State for the last 8 years, and I will be retiring in about 2 weeks. I'm really looking forward to it. It's been a great experience. I went to Penn State as an undergraduate and first came to this campus 50 years ago last month. And I'm now retiring from Penn State, so it's been a great run. Okay. I've had a pretty good life.
Congratulations, Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank
you so much for talking with us
Thank you.
today.
It's been a pleasure.
We are, right?
We are Penn State.
Thank you so much for watching today. From all of us here, we'd like to thank you.